the left is most active in white nations, is a statement that will be pounced upon by the left as being divisive, xenophobic, colonialist, white supremacist, and most certainly racist. I will wait for the scientific evidence. These conditions exist and are objectively wrong in a verifiable way using quantifiable data. No amount of vitriol will be spared to prove white nations are not white. If Democrats can find even one outlier, they will claim all Western nations are composed of many different types of people from all sorts of racial backgrounds. Even historically white areas such as Europe and Britain are either denounced by the left for claiming to be whiter than they are, or for being white when they ought not be, or for being whiter than they should be. There are no voices saying Africa is too black, China too yellow, or reservations too red. Indeed, the very accusation that white nations are too white is tacit evidence that white nations alone are multicultural. But even this is insufficient for liberals. Indeed, if you wish to see a correlate of white fragility, mention a nation that is not historically and culturally white, lacks diversity. Ask why Mecca has no Christians or Jews. Ask why no government outside of historically white nations have whites in their government. The outrage will be palpable. Suggest the French ought to be less concerned about protecting language rights, or that perhaps people in North America need to learn English, and one is a xenophobic racist. To even argue white nations ought to have a border is to be labeled a far-right ultra-nationalist. However, these kinds of tick for tat and yes you are, but what about me arguments lead nowhere, certainly not to a solution. If the claim that the left hates multiculturalism is valid, there ought to be a strong reason for their opposition. Multiculturalism seems to most of us something the left would support, especially given the virtue signaling they are famous for. But all we need to do is to look at the communities of the left and we find cultural and racial homogeneity. Much of their hatred against whites is because they do not want whites around them. Liberals want white free spaces. Multiculturalism gives whites an even chance and a voice at the table. This is why intersectionality replaced multiculturalism. Intersectionality scales virtue on the basis of their victimology, enabling whites to be silenced and lose their place at the table. But it is not the race of whites that is the problem. Nor is it specifically our religion. This is not what the East fights. At issue is our culture, our way of life. The East pushed Christianity west, and this was because the environment of the West was conducive to Christian thought. Rome, however, imperfectly, embraced the teachings of Christ. This was some 300 years after Jesus. But the East embraced Islam and various mystic religions. This is not to say the West was Christian in a fundamental way, but the teachings of Christ were fundamentally more compatible with the cultures of the West where they were alien to the cultures of the East. Obviously, this has to be seen as a serious source of enmity between East and West, but it does not fully explain the Eastern antipathy towards the multicultural enterprise, a value that used to dominate the West. The West was multicultural even before the advent of Christianity. A favorable attitude towards multiculturalism was present in the Roman Empire and other Western nations even before Christ made it a part of Christian culture. Interestingly, the Jews seem able to adapt to any culture and yet remain a people apart. But the East is aggressively homogeneous racially and culturally. This is not a matter of virtue signaling. The openness of the West has nothing to do with being better people, we are just smarter, which is why civilization is really a Western thing. By this we do not mean to attribute a special wisdom to whites, as civilization is not strictly a white thing. It has far more to do with the person. The West used to attract people who were geared towards advancing civilization. Now we attract the barbarian hordes whose intent is to rape and pillage. If this is so, there is a sharp and distinct line between East and West. This is not a racial or even cultural divide, though no doubt some preponderance of features will be seen in these areas. But the West would not be multicultural if civilized behavior was determined by race. But to suggest the West is multicultural whereas the East is not, is to cause us to question the narrative of the East. How can it be the West that is racist, xenophobic and white supremacist if it is the predominantly white nations that have historically been multicultural whereas the East remains decidedly opposed to diversity? Indeed, one has to question if the entire racist trope is not just a diversion. The problem is of course that the West is not multicultural because it hates whites and supports the victimology of the intersectional movement. It is multicultural because its culture is not tied to race. The West is not truly multicultural in that it supports cultural relativism. It simply is open to being proved wrong. The West, by its close association with white people, is what might be thought of as science-orientated. But the same argument we used to explain the Christianization of the West can be applied to the deep association between the methods of science and the West. The West was always open to new influences, and so a process by which the virtue of new ideas could be validated was quickly embraced by even a culture that was deeply religious. The West was even willing to put its faith to the test. Therefore, it was not strange that the West was in the forefront of developing places of learning and promoting the skill of reading and critical analysis. We did not even mind our leaders being free of the protection divine origins had given them. Leaders were fallible, and as fallible they were subject to at least the same scrutiny as the rest of us, if not more. The left hates multiculturalism because it is spiritually Eastern. The East is inherently Gnostic and universalist. Even forming personal identity is a mystical experience. Of course, mysticism is nothing more than interiorization based on emotional experience. This is why the left experiences such trauma and overreacting, and it is why they see words as violence and wrong ideas as microaggression. It is not strictly the idea of a place that has many different cultures existing that bothers atheists, though of course they ultimately want a globalist world state. The multicultural enterprise is just one manifestation of the Western worldview. It is this they actually hate. Not only does the West think we are all equal, it requires we each, as equals, pay our own way. You can have whatever culture or identity you want, so long as it is able to pay its own costs. It's not you thinking you are a trans or gay that is the issue, it is the costs that get leaked over into our space that is the problem. Do what you wish, just do not send us the bill.